And we're back with part 2 of our Game of the Year deliberations. This week we're spending more time on the special awards honors categories. Let's give a quick recap of our award winners so far. For Best Surprise, we awarded Stardew Valley for 2016, and runners-up Doom and Pocket Card Jockey. For Best Looking Game and Visual Style, Overwatch takes it, with Tokyo Mirage Sessions, Sharp FE, and Thumper as the runners-up. Biggest disappointment is Mighty Number 9. Runners-up are Star Fox Zero and No Man's Sky. And finally, last week, we said that Pokemon Sun and Moon is the best mobile handheld game of 2016, with runners-up Reigns and Pocket Card Jockey. Thanks for rejoining us. If you're here for part 2 of our series, I'm Taylor Ray. With me, as always, is my brother and co-host Ryan Ray. So the categories we're going to cover for part 2 include Best New Character, Best Gameplay Moment, Guilty Pleasure of the Year, Biggest Most Important News Story, and finally, Worst Trend to wrap it all up. Ryan, let's go ahead and get started with Best New Character. Run through the list.
All right, so this list is a list of the characters and the game that they appear in. We're going to start off with Diva from Overwatch, Cassie Drake from Uncharted 4: A Thief's End, Sam Drake from Uncharted 4: A Thief's End, The Drifter from Hyper Light Drifter, Lincoln Clay from Mafia 3, Rowlet from Pokemon Sun and Moon, BT7274 from Titanfall 2, and a last-minute addition, Uncle Death from Let It Die. All right, Taylor, I know which ones I would pick, but let's hash it out. What do you think makes this list?
This year, it's kind of a bummer. I don't feel super excited. I don't see like a runaway favorite here in this list like I did with last year's Red Baron in The Witcher 3: The Wild Hunt. That won our award last year. I don't know. For me, I had very few nominations here. I personally nominated Diva, my favorite character in Overwatch. I included Cassie Drake and Sam Drake. And I also added Uncle Death from Let It Die, which was just released last week as a very quirky, weird Suda51 title announced at the PlayStation Experience and quickly released. Very, very interesting, very funny, wacky, zany character. But for me, I don't really have a horse in this race. What about you?
I think for me, this category is not as strong as it was last year. However, they've done some really surprising things with the characters on this list. I think Diva is kind of the embodiment of every gamer meme out there, right? She's like a Mountain Dew drinking, Dorito munching, like gremlin who basically is pretty awesome and fun to play as an actual character.
Well, the funny thing about that is that's part of the meta where the fan base actually created that backstory to her. That's not actually any part of the official Overwatch lore, but I think Blizzard likes the fact that the fan base is creating stories, backstories to all its characters. Essentially, you see all this stuff on the internet, but it's not included in Overwatch officially at all.
Well, they've kind of officially acknowledged that side of her with the emotes. You know, there's one of her basically playing a video game while she's just standing there as a taunt. So she is confirmed a real hardcore gamer with a Z, and probably has a gamer tag with 69 at the end of it.
Well, yeah, that part of her, the fact that she's a gamer, yes, that's official part of the lore, part of the backstory. You know, she is an esports phenomenon from South Korea. That part is true, but the whole everything attached to that, like the Mountain Dew drinking, the Doritos eating stuff, like that's all from memes.
But I actually think like the attachment that we've all grown to Diva specifically, and the Overwatch characters in general, has really spoken to, like, if you recall like the last 10 years of like memorable video game characters, like in like 10 years from now, I think Diva is going to be the standout character from that game. I don't think any other Overwatch character comes close. There's certainly going to be like individual fandoms that, remember McCree or Hanzo or anybody else. But Diva for me is the one that like stands out. And she's not even the main character I play in Overwatch, but she's definitely the one that I think is like brimming with the most personality. And that game doesn't have a story, right? It kind of has this like meta level story that like appears in the opening cutscene, but other than that, it's just like, don't pay attention to any of that stuff. And it really speaks to how strong of a character design Diva is, that Blizzard has gotten all this mileage out of her. So I think she definitely deserves to be one of the 3 candidates. Let's hash it out over the other ones. Between the two Uncharted 4 characters on this list, I actually think Sam Drake plays a bigger role in the game's story than Cassie Drake. Before we go any further, we should remind everybody that this is a spoiler-filled cast, and we will be getting into the endings of games. So if you haven't finished any of these games this year, don't listen to the next few minutes. But anyway, Cassie Drake really only appears at the end of Uncharted 4, after kind of the end set-piece resolution. You fought the big bad guy, and it zooms out to like 20 years later or 15 years later. I don't actually remember specifically, but basically Cassie Drake is Nathan Drake's daughter. You kind of play as her for about 5 minutes while you try to figure out what happened to your parents. And basically she's kind of the next cliffhanger to see, like, if they decide to make more Uncharted games after 4, besides the spin-off that they've already announced, they're going to star Cassie Drake because she's kind of the next Indiana Jones in the legacy, right? But I actually think that while that's a really cool premise, and I think that would be a neat idea to see a female character start in an Uncharted game, it would basically be a mirror of the Tomb Raider series. I actually don't think that moment where you play as her and her as a character, she only has like 5 minutes to really shine. And unless you really explore that beach house and you find out the little details about what she thinks about her parents' exploits, I don't think she's that strong of a character, and I think for that reason I would cut her. Sam Drake, on the other hand, is kind of the like plucky sidekick of Nathan Drake's story in Uncharted 4, and is kind of the character motivation for him to keep going, right? Nathan Drake gets shipwrecked, and he's trying to find his brother, and it turns out that Sam Drake isn't who he says he is. He's kind of like long-lost brother with a troubled past. And basically the plot of Uncharted 4 basically plays out like that movie National Treasure, where they're trying to find the secret, and it's very hokey, but hokey in a fun way, in a way that you might expect from a AAA game of this size. And I think Sam Drake definitely stands out as the like breakaway new character from that game that really propels things forward. He makes some kind of confusing moves to the end where you think everything is resolved, and then he's like, well, wait a minute, I actually just want to make some money off of this. And everybody's telling him like, no, don't do this thing. And then he goes back on his promise, and then he turns out to be a good guy. And he's a very interesting character. I think he's definitely worth conversation about this. I would still keep him on this list for now, but we should talk about some of the other characters too.
Well said. I mean, you made a really strong case for all of them, well, Diva so far and Sam Drake so far. Cassie Drake, I nominated her because I thought it was quite a delightful ending, a surprise, a cliffhanger to Uncharted 4. You know, she embodies sort of the spirit of every bratty teenager that you know, right? Like immature, inquisitive to a fault, nosy. She gets all up in, you know, her parents' business, asking about their past. She even curses, which is sort of like a lighthearted moment. You know, they're lecturing her right on the spot. And I just think that was quite a surprise as part of the epilogue, because you step in her shoes. And what I think is really funny is a throwback, and again, a spoiler for Uncharted 4 and Naughty Dog as a developer, is that, you know, earlier in the game, Nathan Drake actually plays through Crash Bandicoot, like one of the stages. It's sort of like a mini game in the middle of it. And then it ends with Cassie Drake playing the same level, trying to beat her father's score. So I think that's pretty funny, a pretty funny nod to Naughty Dog's previous work, one of their first games ever. So for all those reasons, that's why I thought she was a great new character, but I don't know if she competes with the rest of this, so I'm okay with cutting her. Talk to me about the Drifter, because I always thought he was a silent protagonist in that indie game Hyper Light Drifter.
He is, but in fact, that whole game is basically silent. There are a few sound effects here and there, but there's no character dialogue. There's no voice acting. It's basically a game told entirely through text boxes. And in fact, there's no English letters. It's just symbols and pictures hinting at the story. But I nominated the Drifter because I think with all those constraints, I think they do a really good job of making you feel attached to the Drifter and making you feel like you're kind of, if you imagine the Drifter as kind of like an embodiment of you, the player, he's kind of like your tool of destruction, right? He's your sword. And I think the way that game plays mechanically, you kind of feel by the end of that game like you're one with the Drifter. You actually feel like you're dodging all the bullets. You're speeding around levels, you're solving environmental puzzles, you're slashing, you're fighting these big impossible monsters. I actually think Hyper Light Drifter is this year's answer to Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which is something I didn't know that I needed. But if you really like the combat from that game, definitely check it out. But the Drifter, to me, is one of those characters that doesn't have to speak a word and is just such a strong force in that game. I could see him cutting this list because he is really good. But on the other hand, to argue against him, there's nothing to his personality. You don't really know much of his backstory other than what's told in kind of really artistic cutscenes. But the story of that game is you kind of have to really, really read into it. And this includes the Drifter's backstory. And you actually meet other Hyperlight Drifters in the course of the main game who are also kind of battling against you, some who have kind of fallen in battle and you're taking their stuff. And it's definitely a very interesting universe that if they ever do a Hyperlight Drifter 2, I'm really, really on board. But I would really like to see them kind of go into the backstory. And they don't even have to explain it with words or dialogue. I would just like to see more of this character or other characters like him.
I think you made the case for me. The Drifter, you could swap him out with any other character design, and it would still be the same character. He's still telling the same story through its gameplay and through the cast of characters around him and the environment around him. I just think that as a character, without personality, it's very difficult to win this award. I think the spirit of this award is we're acknowledging the design, the overall developer's intent. There's a coolness factor here, and I just think the Drifter lacks all of that. As a silent protagonist, it's hard to make a very compelling case to say, wow, this should be our best new character without any personality. That's my opinion.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's move on to the next name on this list, which I think is a very interesting character from a very bad game. Very bad is maybe a little harsh, but Lincoln Clay from Mafia 3 is definitely, I think, the standout character from that game as like an African-American protagonist is probably the best version of that we've seen probably since the Walking Dead Telltale game from season 1. Lincoln Clay is just like well written, well voice acted. His motivations for doing everything is super smart. The way they tackle race in that game is also very well done. And then there are these little quiet moments, these very subtle moments that you don't really notice unless you're paying attention. So, for example, in that game, you go up against basically what is the Ku Klux Klan, and Lincoln Clay is a black character, and you have the option over the game to potentially save or kill the racket bosses that you go after. And then you come up against the Ku Klux Klan and you come up to the racket boss of that. And because he's black and he hates the Ku Klux Klan, you don't get the option. He just kills him out of spite, out of all the really shitty racist stuff that group has done in the game. And that obviously the KKK has done in real life. And it's just one of those like very satisfying character moments. The ending of that game is basically whether Lincoln Clay decides whether or not to stay in New Bordeaux or to leave and go somewhere else to like never be seen again. And I think regardless of the choice, like he's such a strong character that even though the game itself is very rote, the thing that keeps you motivated through that entire game is Lincoln Clay's story. And I definitely think he deserves to be in the conversation. For me, I think he actually wins this category. We can save that conversation for 5 minutes from now, but I definitely think he deserves to be one of the three.
Okay, fair enough. I trust your judgment on him because I haven't played the game, but it seems like a very strong protagonist. The backstory to him is quite interesting, so I'm eager to hear more about him, and we'll keep him on the list for now. So let's recap what we have so far. We have Diva from Overwatch, Sam Drake from Uncharted 4 Thief's End, Lincoln Clay, Mafia 3, and then we have yet to discuss Rowlet from Pokemon Sun and Moon, BT7274 from Titanfall 2, and Uncle Death from Let It Die. Rowlet, as a Pokemon, one of the original starter Pokemon that you can opt to choose at the start of the game, looks like an owl, but has a very funny look to him, and appeal to him, charm, certainly. He's got 2 leaves that make up his bow tie. He has a very cute, owl-sounding battle cry, right? Like that's his character. That's his character design. Why do you think he's one of the best new characters? I thought this was a joke ad from you.
This is a little bit of a joke ad. I actually don't think Pokemon have they don't, there isn't like I would actually play a Pokemon game where you play exclusively as Rowlet. I think of the three new starters, he's definitely the standout one. I think
of all the Pokemon games, I think that Pokemon Sun and Moon has the most polarizing starters I think I've ever seen. And that might be a product of, Twitter not being around for past Pokemon games. But to me, people are like, oh, I'm Team Poplio, or Poplio's the worst, right? That's the water starter. And then Litten as the fire starter. People are so adamant about their favorite starters. Even before the game was released, I've never seen anything like it before.
But I actually think that, like, in the 20 years that Pokemon has existed, the only starters that we really talk about are Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, Mudkip as a joke, and up until this point, like, we haven't really talked about, like, Cyndaquil or Chikorita or any of the other, like, okay starters. They're perfectly acceptable as the kind of, like, rock, paper, scissors of the, like, first Pokemon that you encounter in the game. But, like, up until this point, nobody has really kind of, like, captured the imagination of Pokemon players, basically up until these three starters. And I think of the three, like, Rowlet has totally completely dominated the conversation because he's the cutest of the three. The little bow tie adds a lot. Is it a bow tie or is it a bikini top? Like, take a look and you tell me.
I never considered the bikini top.
I think Rowlet's evolution is actually pretty lame. So there's a case to be made to, like, not evolve him. However, I think that was the beginning and the end of our conversation of him as our best new character. Let's cut him from this list. Objectively, I think Rowlet is the best new Pokemon from the entire new Pokemon Sun and Moon, and we can have that debate all we want, but let's move on. There just isn't, like, a story for individual Pokemon quite yet, and until they come up with, like, a Rowlet's adventure, or like a Hey You Pikachu, but with Rowlet, we can have that conversation later.
Or maybe add the new category of best new Pokemon of this year.
Right, exactly. All right, let's move on to a very interesting entry, B27274 in Titanfall 2. So if you weren't aware, Titanfall 2 has a single-player campaign this time, and actually a pretty decent single-player. Very surprising. It has some very surprising mechanics. We'll talk about that in another category, actually. But B27274 is basically your Titan in the single-player campaign, and he stands out as kind of like this very robotic character, but he kind of becomes more human to you over time. You get kind of very attached to him, and then he kind of meets a very unfortunate end, and he actually helps you all the way past his death, right? Like, you're kind of, like, captured by the enemy, and then he's all broken down, and then he tells you to basically, like, open up his eye socket that unlocks this, like, auto targeting lock-on gun that totally helps you through the end of the game. And, like, it just, to the end, like, I've never felt this strongly about a robotic companion basically since HK-47 in Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. This character really made me enjoy a robot in a game that I haven't seen in quite some time, and it could have been like a write-off character in, like, a very by-the-numbers military first-person shooter campaign, and we have so many of those this year. And B27274 definitely, like, stands out as just kind of like a really nice, surprising character. BT for short. Just like, what a great character, and way better than the, like, player character protagonist that you play has a totally forgettable name, Jack Cooper or whatever. It says a lot that the standout person from that game is a robot.
And BT, I think, to compare him to, let's say, like, an artificial AI, I like to think of him as like a Jarvis. If you've seen the Marvel movies, like the Avengers, it's Iron Man's AI companion. We talk about other famous AIs, and not necessarily in mech form, but like Cortana, for instance. Absolutely legendary. BT doesn't... Well, let me back up for a second. I don't want to say that BT equals Cortana at all. I mean, Cortana is in a whole nother ballpark, but I think it's sort of in the spirit of that, right? Like, this is someone that follows you along that's not necessarily playable, who influences, major plot points in Titanfall 2.
Right, and to compare him to the other first-person shooter game, this big first-person shooter game that's like this year, in Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, you also have a robotic companion that also tries to do this, like, make him feel human, make him feel like an actual person. Call of Duty's take on that trope is is okay, but compared to BT, like just doesn't hold a candle. BT is such like a strong, driving, motivating force in Titanfall 2 single player campaign that like you want him to be like your companion the entire time. He's super dog. He's, you know, think of he's the Robin to your Batman, except that he actually like kind of overshadows you as Batman, right? Like he does such a good job of making sure that like you're safe and that you have exactly the kind of firepower you need. The one criticism I would say of the Titanfall 2 single player campaign is that you don't actually get to play as him all that often, like with you and the Titan. I actually would have preferred a few more levels of you and the Titan, kind of in sync with BT, but with the time that you do have with him, he's certainly a very standout part of that entire game. So I think he deserves to be part of the conversation. I want you to talk to me about Uncle Death because this is kind of the newest addition to our list. And I always like Suda51's verve in these kinds of games, but I don't know anything about this character.
Yeah, so Suda51 is sort of known for extremely cheesy games like Shadows of the Damned. What else am I forgetting?
Killer is Dead.
Killer is Dead. That's another good example.
Killer 7.
Killer 7, Lollipop Chainsaw, right? These are all very bizarre, wacky, zany games. It's hard to pick out any one character in Suda51 because all the characters are memorable, wacky, zany, just like him as a creative developer. But the thing about Uncle Death is he is, you know, he's essentially the mascot of this brand new game, Let It Die, which dropped as a surprise late last week for this roguelike free-to-play hack-and-slash game. It looks like the Grim Reaper with, instead of a cloak, he has sort of this hoodie, and he rides around on a skateboard, and he has these vintage X-ray glasses always on, or if you're listening to him through dialogue and you see his little character portrait pop up, they're like the vintage 3D glasses. And he has this sort of off accent. You could tell this voice actor is not a native speaker, or they're doing a really great job of adding a tinge of like a Mexican accent, I think is what it is. And so it lends itself to saying like, wow, this is sort of an off the wall character. Like he's disappearing and reappearing like Nightcrawler, rides on his skateboard and walks you through the tutorial. He's just always omnipresent in this game. I just think the look to him is very, very funny and wacky. And they use him in really interesting ways in their marketing, in their trailers. They even had like a man on the street, like a real live person dress up as Uncle Death. And they sort of do these like weird, bizarre Adult Swim like, dark humor style interviews with Uncle Death standing right there. So I just like what Suda51 has done with this character. Like it just embodies what this game is. It's a very bizarre game.
So I have a question about this, and this will kind of determine for me whether he deserves to stay on this list or not. So the other memorable characters in like Suda51's universe, right? Like try naming one. The only ones that I can name are like the Smith like assassin clan from Killer 7, right? And then they're split up into 7 different like unique split personalities if you want to go there. I think the other Suda51's other games, like they all have this kind of like style to them, and I think they're very like edgy and very unique in terms of like what we see in video games. But I don't think Uncle Death is doing anything different than what that is from the sounds of it. You could pop in Uncle Death in like Lollipop Chainsaw or Killer is Dead, and he would totally be in place, right? The Suda51 would cock up some explanation for why the Grim Reaper with a skateboard and sunglasses in a hoodie like shows up, yeah. Right? Like you could totally see him doing that. And so for me, like, unless Uncle Death does something amazing, or he's like the final boss and Let It Die at the end of the dungeon or whatever, like unless there's more like, I want to say like character development, because Suda51 games can go one of two ways, right? They're either like weird games that make you question everything that life is about, or it's a totally like throwaway character like in Lollipop Chainsaw, where it totally celebrates the like gore and the just like sheer wackiness of it.
Yeah, the sheer cheesiness. And I just think I like his character design so much, but not necessarily the character itself. Like, you're right, there's not much character development. He's just there. It was a really cool character. I don't necessarily think he had like a ton of personality or a story to tell. Let's put it that way.
Right. Like, so if we're cutting the Drifter, I also think for the same reason we have to cut Uncle Death, right? Like,
all right.
Yeah. All right. So this conversation now is between Lincoln Clay and B27274. One of these games you didn't play, and one of these games you did.
Despite me not playing Mafia 3, I think because of the nature of the storytelling of that game, I did read your review about it on our site, and I just feel like as a human we can connect with Lincoln Clay a little bit better. It tells the story of an emerging America in the late 1960s, fighting for civil rights, but we're talking about a backwater place, something that like New Orleans, where there's very much like white supremacists running around. There's gang violence. The decisions that you make in the game, and from what I could tell, there's some pretty memorable side missions. I've heard that the main storyline, not so much, but Lincoln Clay, to me, I think we can consider as one of the top 3 over BT 7274.
Okay, I can totally see that argument. Let's cut BT. I think Lincoln Clay, for me, is one of those characters that totally could have been written very poorly, right? Like, even in the Mafia franchise, right? The Mafia games are basically like Godfathers, but more of a period piece. Mafia 3 totally could have been that if not for its like major African American protagonist. He's not a stereotype at all. He has very good quote in scare quotes motivations. He's very well written, as he said. He doesn't even get along with other potentially like black characters. So there's this faction, the Haitians, that you kind of deal with and actually turn out to be one of your lieutenants. And he doesn't trust the like main leader, the character Cassandra. It's like one of those things where she actually questions. It's just like, are you with us or are you against us? And he's just like, I'm not with or against anybody. I'm just here for my mission. I want to fuck over this guy who fucked me. It's one of those things that like, he's the only reason you continue playing Mafia 3. He's just the strongest character in that entire thing. And the sub-characters that he kind of has to deal with are like total jokes. Like the rest of the characters, the Haitian lady I mentioned is basically like the voodoo person, and she teaches you how to like throw voodoo dolls to distract enemies. And there's like an Irish character, and surprise, he's like a member of the IRA and also like a raging alcoholic. It's all these like horrible stereotypes that Lincoln Clay has to deal with. And he also could have been written as one of those like really jokey, not very serious takes on this trope. And he's not. He's written very seriously. He's like the best written character in that entire game. I think for me, he kind of like stands out as this year's best new character. If I put him up against like Diva, who really doesn't have a story but is all personality, like I think Diva is very colorful, but she's definitely for me like the best character from Overwatch. But there isn't anything about her that would lead me to pick her over somebody else that has like more fun abilities or has like a more fun backstory than anybody else in Overwatch. I think she's kind of like equivalent on that front. And I think compared to Sam Drake, like Sam Drake is your sidekick. He's just kind of, there are moments in that game where I actually didn't like where the story went with him as a character, and like they could have done a better job. Or set him up to be the next protagonist in the next series of Uncharted games. But they decide not to do that. They decide to just like continue have him play the crooked man, as it were. I'd rather play in a game as Sully at that point. Sully's a way better character, I think, than Sam Drake.
Sam Drake, I thought, was way too predictable. I enjoyed the character development because you're all of a sudden a brother who's very much in need, and then he turns into a very sort of gray area crook where his motivations aren't very clear. He lies to his brother after many, many times of very close death encounters with his brother on these adventures. Like Nathan Drake tags along with Sam as sort of, I'm doing this to save you, to protect you. Like the overall mission is, to find this pirate treasure in order to pay off Sam's debts. And it turns out that wasn't the case at all. Sam Drake just wanted to he had his own selfish goals. He just wanted to make riches for himself. Like there was no overarching, like, I have a debt to pay. And so I thought that was sort of an interesting twist. But overall, I thought the twist was kind of predictable. You saw it coming. He's very similar to Nathan Drake in the sense that he's this, plucky rogue. You can't quite trust him, but he has great capabilities, abilities, right? He's a great fighter. He has a lot of keen survival sense. I don't know. It was a blockbuster AAA title. Like, I will say the performance of those voice actors was superb. I don't think you could act better than those two, but for the characters that they're playing, the way they're written, I just wasn't that big of a fan.
And Uncharted 4 is like one of your favorite games this year, right? So that's like means a lot coming from you, that like at the end of the day, like Sam Drake is a strong character from that certainly a standout, but again, is way too predictable. You see his arc coming a mile away. They don't do enough with him. Like, I wish he had more interesting dialogue that came out of his mouth. If you asked whether Troy Baker or Nolan North should be in an Uncharted game, the answer to that is yes. But I would rather see somebody else play off of Nolan North's kind of jokiness that he's kind of always embodied in the Uncharted games. And like, Sam Drake is supposed to be the foil to make you show how crappy Nathan has treated like his closest relatives, right? And he ends up not really doing all that much. The person who makes Nathan Drake feel crappier is Elena, right? His wife. That almost makes the case for her to be on this list more than Sam. But I think definitely Sam is kind of your more constant companion in that game. Definitely deserves to be one of the three, but for me, I don't think he wins this category.
Just to rewind a little bit, what you mentioned about Diva, and the thing I really don't like about Overwatch is the fact that a lot of the story is separate from the game, not accessible in the game. Blizzard has put out these sort of cinematics on social media, on their website, and you have to seek that out independently. But let's say you don't follow Blizzard at all, you don't follow those Overwatch social accounts, you're not going to experience this stuff. Like, that part bothers me a lot. It is a multiplayer game only. If they had a single player campaign, there is the opportunity to go into these characters' backstories and tell the overarching story. But the opening cinematic doesn't do enough to build any character, literally none of the characters. And there is such a rich story to tell. And if you do read up on the lore and you do watch these videos outside of the game, it's very interesting. Like, it's a very cool story, but you have to go way out of your way to find out what these characters are about, including Diva. Diva's personality shines through her emotes, her skins. It's just a bummer that a story can't be told within the game. Like, it's just pure gameplay in the game itself, and you have to access all this content, the story-related content, outside of the game. So that, to me, you can't separate that from this category, from this award. Well, we've criticized a lot of the top three, with the exception of Lincoln Clay. So maybe by default, Lincoln Clay does win. I'll take your word for it because I have not played Mafia 3. But, between Diva and Sam Drake, even though we're shooting them down quite a bit, I still like them overall, despite, their weaknesses. Diva is, again, my favorite character to play, has a ton of personality just in playing her. You can see a story just by looking at the character model. And Sam Drake, even though I wish his storyline was a little bit better, I think the moments in the game where he opens up to Nathan Drake, and these are not within major story beats, this is like side dialogue as you're actually playing the game, in these quieter spots when you're not facing enemies, that are really, really funny, that really tell that these are close brothers that like taking jabs at each other. And I think that part is very interesting. And I think that's what makes Sam Drake a compelling character. It's when those moments come up is when he, I think, really, really shines. And also his interactions with other characters besides Nathan too. The way he responds to Elena and responds to Sully as well. You can't discount those either. I won't get into all of the story about Uncharted 4, but you can completely see why he's a likable character after all as you finish the game.
Yeah, and Lincoln Clay definitely our winner for this category. Like, from the moment go, like, the open tutorial mission kind of explains his backstory and why he's on this kind of like revenge quest. Amazing character, great dialogue. I want Lincoln Clay in a better game. Compared to other characters like him, like Franklin in GTA 5 is probably the closest analog, right? And like, Franklin totally didn't get the screen time that he deserved in GTA 5, but Lincoln Clay totally does. And he, like, even compared to Watch Dogs 2, which also has an African-American protagonist, Ubisoft didn't do enough with that character. I think Lincoln Clay definitely stands out. And for that reason, I think he is this year's best new character, definitely from us. He's worth sticking around for the relatively mediocre game that Mafia 3 is, just to see how his stuff plays out.
All right, there we have it. It's Lincoln Clay from Mafia 3, and runners-up D.Va from Overwatch and Sam Drake for Uncharted 4, A Thief's End. Congratulations to Mafia 3 with Lincoln Clay as the best new character of 2016. Moving on to our next category, we have Best Gameplay Moment.
Definitely a lot of strong gameplay moments this year, a lot of things that I will be remembering for a very long time. Let's go down this list. Doom's opening, Titanfall 2's time travel level, I believe that's called Effect and Cause, Superhot's possession mechanic payoff, Hyperlight Drifter's opening, returning to Anne Orlando in Dark Souls 3, Battlefield 1's tutorial mission, Mafia 3's post-credits to Stinger, Uncharted 4's auction mission, throwing the fire extinguisher in Hitman's tutorial, Battlefield 1's Zeppelin explosions, Hitman's Agent 47 plays drum solo disguised, Ethan and Reyes discuss mortality in Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion, Inside's ending, in parentheses both of them, and finally Uncharted 4's nostalgic dinner scene. Taylor, I think there are a few games that we've duplicated here because we both played a lot of these games, and I think for me we have to kind of do an either or on those moments. So let's start off with those kind of duplicates. Let's put up Battlefield 1's tutorial mission versus the Zeppelin explosions that you see in multiplayer.
Battlefield 1's tutorial mission, wow, that was a shocking moment. It just sticks you as a character in World War I, as an American, and you're trying to survive this very, very intense German offensive in trench warfare, surrounded by all sides. Tanks start approaching. You hear artillery in the distance, and you're trying to hold on as long as possible. And what the tutorial does, and it doesn't really tell you this, but the point is to die. I was shocked at that when I was playing through the tutorial. I was like, man, I keep getting shot at. I keep ducking behind cover. I don't know if I can hold on. This is going to be really, really hard to get through this first mission. But I ended up dying. I was like, okay, I have to see what happens. Maybe it is story related. And sure enough, it was. And all of a sudden, you see your soldier's name and their date of birth and their date of death. And all of a sudden, that humanizes your character. And you say, wow, that was super intense. And then all of a sudden, it zooms in and you take over another soldier who instead has a different weapon. And what's interesting about this tutorial mission is that, in a sense, through this extremely, extremely intense battle, I mean, you could not make it more intense. So there's this fog of war. It's dark. I mean, you're surrounded on all sides. Like, the sound design of Battlefield 1 is just amazing. It really felt like I was truly in war, and it's not a feeling that I've ever really felt with any other game. And it was super intense. And again, same situation. You get overwhelmed, you die, you move on to the next character. And this happens a couple of different times until you experience the major gameplay aspects of that game. You play through and shoot different kinds of guns, you man a turret, those sorts of things. Very, very shocking.
I think you've actually built a very strong case for that superseding the Zeppelin explosions. For me, the Zeppelin explosions in multiplayer are like the big set piece moment from that game's multiplayer, which is definitely the focus of Battlefield 1. And in that level where you could potentially, spawn on top of the Zeppelin, control the Zeppelin, kind of have the aerial battle that you want. World War I didn't have a lot, had very rudimentary technology, right? You can kind of see that in some of the other multiplayer levels where you fly the planes. It's not easy to aim. It's in fact, I would say, gameplay wise, is a step back from even controlling the very unwieldy jets that you could in Battlefield 3. But the Zeppelin exploding and kind of changing the multiplayer level as it kind of goes down is a cool moment for sure. Very interesting. But I think when you compare it to the kind of endless meat grinder of the tutorial mission, and just to show you how awful World War I really was. Every time you die in that tutorial mission, it kind of like shows that character's like lifespan in terms of amount of years that they've lived. And then it spawns you right back in as like another character on that front. And it's just like, wow, what like a powerful visual metaphor, what like powerful message that sends throughout the rest of Battlefield 1. I think it totally tops the Zeppelin explosions.
Okay, agreed.
All right, we also need to talk about Hitman and whether or not the drum solo disguise of Hitman 47 or Hitman's Agent 47 really nailing it versus the first time that the game reveals how silly it's going to be when you throw that fire extinguisher at that chef the very first time in the tutorial level. What do you think between those two stands out?
When I played through that tutorial level, I didn't grab the fire extinguisher. I think there was a cleaver on the table and I threw it at his head. And I didn't really see a gameplay moment there. What happens when you grab the fire extinguisher instead?
I mean, basically, it's teaching you how to throw objects at people's heads, and not every object is going to be like a direct, like lethal kill, right? That game is so much fun because it's kind of like a true assassination sandbox that the Hitman games have always strived for, but have never really quite topped the mark for. And I think the fire extinguisher is there, and even the game instructs you to throw the fire extinguisher at his head. So you didn't follow the instructions. Way to go, Taylor. But I think the fire extinguisher moment for me kind of just showed that like this game is just going to be like off the wall fun. It just opens up the possibilities of having so many like tools at your disposal and tools that you really don't think you're going to have in some of these levels. Right? They kind of vary up the level a little bit between the different scenarios that you're given, and it's not always going to be a fire extinguisher. Sometimes it's going to be an axe or a big box or
but why? I don't think you're making a case for why it's the best gameplay moment. Why specifically is the fire extinguisher a great moment?
I just think it happens early on. Most people are going to experience that. Most people aren't going to pick up the cleaver. They're going to pick up the fire extinguisher. I kind of agree with you on that basis that, it's kind of, this game is very freeform and not everybody's going to experience that. I think there are probably other ways in that tutorial mission that the game teaches you that how off the wall and how like honestly fun it is to play.
Yeah. I still don't get why it was even on the list. It's just something that the game is trying to teach you. Was it supposed to be funny? Did something happen that I didn't see? What happens when you throw the fire extinguisher at the cook's head? He dies, right? Or he gets knocked out.
Yeah, he gets knocked out. He gets knocked out unconscious,
and that's it. Nothing else happens.
Okay, so the drum solo moment is something that happens in the Thailand level where you have two targets to take down, and it's basically this very crappy Justin Bieber knockoff who's kind of like a international superstar, pop star that you have to kill, and then the other target who's way less interesting is his lawyer. And there's an opportunity in that level to basically be a part of the band and be this kind of like freelance drummer that he kind of takes on. And one of the ways that you can actually approach the target privately is you actually have a kind of moment where you approach the recording studio and the guy asks you to perform a drum solo just so that you are who you say you are. And you totally think at that moment that Agent 47 is going to totally
blow his cover,
crap out and be like, okay, screw this. I'm going to kill you. Bam. And then instead what he does is he sits down in front of the drum kit and he totally plays like an awesome drum solo for like 2 minutes and totally nails it. And then the guy's like, okay, wow, like let me get you up into like my private suite and we can like work out a contract or whatever. And then that's your opportunity to kill him. But that moment is just like, it's really funny. And it's so surprising to see that like Agent 47 is such a good chameleon. He's such a good person, such a good assassin that he can even nail things that you don't think he would be good at.
Yeah, exactly. It's so unexpected. And that has to be one of the major reasons why we have to pick it as one of the best gameplay moments. It's so unexpected. And like, I totally expected your cover to get blown. There are a lot of fail states in Hitman where you're in a specific disguise and you don't act out the character that you're supposed to be. And in that case, I was like, man, I'm dressed up as this band member. I'm going to go into this recording studio. He's going to ask me to play. And then that's it. And then I'm going to have to start butchering everybody in that, and so there are no witnesses. And that's not what happens. It's just very, very funny. And I think the intent was there. They wanted you to discover that. He's just such a jack of all trades. It's so funny. And I really enjoyed that moment. I think we still have to keep it on this list. I think it's a really strong contender.
Okay. I want to talk about the standout thing that has to be on this list of 3. I think Doom's opening. Opening first 10 minutes is like awesome. Probably the strongest opening I've experienced in a game basically since the original BioShock. Like Doom's opening basically shows you as the kind of Doom guy, right? But you're not in your like trademark armor. You have to kind of find that. And in the course of that first 10 minutes, you basically discover that this ancient, this generation of people, while you've been kind of like laying dormant, crystallized in your like Han Solo carbonite or whatever, have basically come to worship the Doom guy as this kind of like fallen god who like saved us all from the hell demons or whatever. And then so that happens. You see all that in the holograms, and then you put on the Doom guy armor, which is just like this like ultimate power fantasy of every first person shooter you've ever played. And it's just like, all right, I'm becoming this character again.
Yeah. And the Marine costume is like on this altar, and it's surrounded by satanic offerings and candles and skulls and bones. It's so incredible. It's so visceral.
Right. And then you see the sarcophagus that you've been laying in, and then basically all hell breaks loose again, for the umpteenth time. And you as the Marine, the Doom guy, have to go back and save the world again. And everything about that first 10 minutes of Doom shows you why that franchise has kind of stood as the ultimate classic, the game that defined an entire genre, and they're bringing it up again and doing it in a totally new and inventive way. But it also kind of takes itself super self-seriously, which is something I really, really appreciate about the new Doom. It's one of those games that gives tribute to the old games, but also adds a lot of new stuff on top of it to make you remember why this game franchise has stood as kind of a classic in the test of time.
Well, we've already picked 3 we want to keep on this list. Let's start eliminating some others. So we still have left Titanfall 2's time travel level, Superhot's possession mechanic payoff, Hyper Light Drifter's opening, Return to Anor Londo in Dark Souls 3, Mafia 3's post-credit stinger, Uncharted 4's auction mission, throwing the fire extinguisher. Oh, no, we already eliminated that one. That was in Hitman's tutorial. Ethan and Reyes discuss mortality in Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion, Inside Endings, both of them, and Uncharted 4's nostalgic dinner scene. I have to be honest with you, I played through Uncharted 4, love that game. I do not remember this dinner scene.
So the dinner scene is the moment that happens in that game where basically you are on the couch with Elena, or you as Nathan Drake are on the couch with Elena, and you're kind of having like a date night or whatever. And they're eating dinner. They're having a very real human conversation that if you've ever been in any kind of relationship, whether it's romantic or a friendship, and you've kind of like you're hanging out, it's a very casual conversation. It's a very relatable scene. And then it kind of devolves into this playful, like it shows you why they're actually in love. And then you start playing Crash Bandicoot randomly in the middle of Uncharted 4. And that's
now I remember that part.
Yeah, so that's the part where it's just like you're trying to settle an argument and you're like, okay, we're going to settle this argument. And then they bust out like the thing that Naughty Dog was originally known for, Crash Bandicoot, like a throwback. And they played one of the standout Crash Bandicoot levels where you're running away from the boulder and you're trying to like top Elena's high score. And then they replay that moment later when you play as Nathan and Elena's daughter, Cassie, where you get the opportunity to play that level again. I think for me that is a standout scene from that game. It's certainly kind of a fun throwback moment. But you barely remembered the dinner scene, and you liked the Crash Bandicoot moment.
Yeah, I mean, I remembered the Crash Bandicoot moment, obviously. I forgot the lead up to it. That is obviously a pivotal moment in that game where Nathan decides he's going to help out his brother and go on another adventure, but hide that fact from Elena. And that starts off the majority of that game, leaving his home, his simple life, his day job. Yeah, it was a nice, relatable moment, but I just don't think it beats out what we have so far at the top of this list. Doom's opening, Battlefield 1's tutorial mission that was so impactful and humanizing, and then Hitman's drum solo. Those are just much more memorable. So I don't know, that's again another reason why I sort of want to cut it. There are much better moments, I think, in Uncharted 4, and we didn't even nominate them in this category.
Okay, then let's do a couple of other very easy cuts. I think we can safely cut the Ethan and Reyes discuss mortality and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. So that game's single-player campaign is a lot better than it deserves to be, a lot more fun than you might expect. But there's a moment in that game where you, as Reyes, basically die, and you're thrown out into space, and your robot companion, Ethan, comes out with you and tries to save you. And you end up discussing, as you're running out of oxygen, as you're dying, as you're watching your kind of like life flash before your eyes, that you kind of have this very like touching human moment. And you discuss about like what the meaninghood of brotherhood is and life and death. I think it's a nice moment, but that whole game, every protagonist in that game dies. And it's a standout moment from that single player campaign, but I don't think it stands up compared to some of these other gameplay moments.
Okay, what about some of the other ones that we can keep? I've heard a lot about Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion.
So that's on this list because I think that's a really cool level. It has really great level design. The level actually changes as you progress through it to kind of show you unlockable paths. It's unlike anything else in that game. It has, you kind of go up against Clockwork Soldiers. Your target in that game is this kind of Tesla-like character, and you can decide actually to play that entire game non-lethally or lethally. And the way you deal with the target non-lethally is super interesting. You basically set up a science experiment for him to kind of fall prey to, his own science experiment that he should know better. And the entire level from start to finish is probably the standout moment from that entire game. It's a lot of fun. It's the best level in Dishonored 2. It really challenges you to decide whether or not you're going to use your powers or if you're going to like sneak up behind the walls in kind of like a Portal style fashion of like, you could go along the main path and totally progress through the game that way, or you could kind of see behind the curtain and, this guy who's kind of a Wizard of Oz like character, go behind the scenes and totally do it the stealth way too. It's just a very, very cool level.
I've read and I've heard that it's one of the best level designs ever in gaming history. So I think we have to keep it on this list for that aspect alone. So what do we have left? Titanfall's 2 time travel level, Superhot's possession mechanic payoff. I think we should cut that. That is a big moment in that game, but it's a massive power that you all of a sudden acquire. That this game is about bullet dodging, and it's a bullet time Matrix style gameplay. And then usually you're stealing guns from your enemies, but in this case, what you're doing is you can all of a sudden swap places and immediately kill whoever you swap bodies with. And so you all of a sudden take possession of somebody else's body and then control the character that way. So it's kind of a cool moment. But beyond that, you do it a dozen other times beyond that. I think it's kind of boring after that. It makes the game way too easy after that.
And I actually think that the final encounter in that game kind of diminishes the mechanic payoff. So the final level in Superhot, you basically are trying to hack a computer that's been kind of controlling you. You're trying to get like inside the machine, right? And to do that, you actually have to possess the computer, and then like you make it about a third of the way, and then it kicks you out, and then you have to do more possessions. And I actually think that like diminishes the power of that mechanic. I think if they had presented that a little bit differently, or if that mechanic had manifested itself in more interesting levels, I think that would be more of an argument to keep it on this list. But I agree with you that I don't think it's going to stand up against some of these other ones. I want to talk to you a little bit about Hyper Light Drifter's opening, which is a very strong opening. I would put it up there with Doom's opening. Very memorable, but it's kind of memorable from an artistic standpoint. I'm thinking of the one cutscene, the one image I can visualize where you see the kind of the old giants up against the past, and you think you're going to be fighting these massive titans, and all of a sudden they like crumble to dust in front of you, and then you kind of wake up and you realize that it was all a dream, and you try to like make your way back to town, and the game just like you walk down the side of this mountain, and it has this like incredible panoramic vista. I actually think it says a lot that to me really stood out, that the first 10 minutes of that game stood out to me stylistically, but I don't think it really pays off. You don't really get to find out what really happened to those Titans. And I think compared to the rest of the game visually, those first 10 minutes really stand out, and the rest of it is pleasant to look at, but it isn't doing anything different than a lot of other games of that style, like Fez, or anything that's like, 8-bit, 16-bit era that is going for. So I think we should cut Hyperlight Drifter's opening, even as a big fan of it. I think for the same reason, I'm also going to cut Returning to Anne Orlando and Dark Souls 3. That's basically returning to an old, very memorable section of the original Dark Souls. I had the chance to play Dark Souls 3 multiple times because unfortunately, my PC crashed in the middle of multiple playthroughs of that. So I had the chance to play that through that campaign 3 times. And while I think that's a cool moment the first time it happens, it's very a nice throwback for fans of the series. I don't think it stands out. I don't think it does anything special. And the actual section that you play through of it in Dark Souls 3 isn't that fun. Not one of the top 3 best gameplay moments.
Okay, and you're going to have to talk to me about the Mafia 3 post-credits stinger. Again, massive spoiler, obviously, since it happens after the game ends.
All right, so I actually need to pull up an article for this because it's so crazy that I have to get into the kind of the details. Okay, so the plot of Mafia 3 is you play as Lincoln Clay, and it's this revenge fantasy, right? Somebody who helps you propel that revenge quest is a CIA agent named John Donovan. And the way that game is presented, it's presented in this like Netflix documentary style, where it's basically telling this story. It's already happened, and it's cutting in between these characters who played a part in Lincoln Clay's story, who are kind of telling an interviewer like what really happened. So all these cutscenes happen. The main gameplay happens. You find out what happens. Spoilers, Lincoln Clay gets his revenge. And at the end of all of it, whatever your choice is, at the end they present the end arc of John Donovan's, the CIA agent who's been helping you all along. It turns out that his interviews, he's on a like congressional panel where he's being grilled by these senators who are asking like, well, why did you help this guy? He was killing a bunch of people. He was clearly building this like mafia like organization that's very illegal. That's like, why would the CIA get involved with that? And it turns out that if you're a big fan of American history, Mafia 3 really goes off the deep end, because at the end, at the post-credit stinger, it shows you that John Donovan's all the motivation behind his helping Lincoln Clay was because he believes that one of the senators from Louisiana who's grilling you this entire time is actually connected to the John F. Kennedy assassination. And the whole reason the CIA agent helped you out was because he wanted to get revenge for this guy being involved with JFK and his death.
Wow.
So
whoa.
so that happens.
That's a super strong
So that
case
happens.
for best.
He reveals his motivation, and then he like gets up in front of the Senate hearing and like shoots the senator.
What?
And it's like totally, and it's just like it made my mouth drop. At like it's totally not worth playing the rest of Mafia 3 to get to that moment. But I just needed to like air that out because it's so crazy. And if you're one of those people who like, there have been a ton of like conspiracy theories about John F. Kennedy's like real life assassination, right? And this game totally plays with that notion that like the mafia guy that Lincoln Clay is going after is connected with all of that. The senator that's been grilling you this entire time is also connected with that. And the real reason that this like white guy CIA agent has been helping Lincoln Clay this entire time is because he like wants to get back at them. That's just like so crazy that like
wow. That's a really great story.
That takes real balls to include in a game, but I just wish that they didn't I wish they throw that at the end of the main game. I wish that was the payoff. I wish you didn't have to sit through credits. I wish you didn't have to sit through an entire really mediocre game to get to that moment. It's so crazy, but you have to work too hard to get to it.
But here's the thing though. I think you can still have a best gameplay moment in a mediocre game, in a game that's filled with low or middling gameplay moments overall. You can still have that one moment that's super memorable, and just hearing you tell the story, that's awesome. That's amazing. I can't believe that twist. That's great. And this is coming from somebody who's never played Mafia 3. I'm taking your word for it. That to me, I mean, I kind of want to crown it now, even though this would be the second category we would award related to Mafia 3, but that sounds amazing. That's a great real life sort of tie-in. That's very shocking. I really, really like that. Cinematic, right? It's a cinematic. You don't play through it, right?
Correct. It's a cinematic.
If you really want to be ultra technical, it's technically not a gameplay moment, but I don't know if we're excluding it because it happens after the credits and technically you're not playing through it, but it's still a story piece. It's still part of the arc, right? And it leaves this massive cliffhanger. Perhaps they can do a sequel to this game that brings back Lincoln Clay.
Potentially.
What do you think? I personally think it could win this category.
I think it could win. It deserves to be in the conversation as one of the three. I'll leave it highlighted for now, and we will circle back to that argument. All right, so let's talk about Titanfall 2's time travel level called Effect and Cause. Definitely the best level in the single player campaign. This is a level where you basically get a time travel device and you can use it to go back and forth between the dimensions, and it's a really fun gameplay mechanic. It's easily the best level in that entire campaign. I don't think it's doing anything different than another first-person shooter that I don't think really anybody played, Singularity.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. It's exactly like Singularity.
However, it's the only time that this mechanic appears in that game. It's a one-off, and they actually do a good job of making that mechanic feel right. You actually have to take cover in the one dimension, or you have to do this like platforming section where you have to, wall run and then switch between the dimensions in the middle of your wall run. It's really, really cool. It's a level that they spent a lot of time developing, and I think it deserves to be worth as part of the conversation. But, I would have played another level where they did a little bit more with that. But if I'm being honest with you, I think like Doom's opening is a better level design. I think Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion is a better level design. And if this was like truly new, it would be doing something other than like a game that 5 years ago did. Like if Singularity didn't exist, this would like totally blow my mind. I hope that this is them experimenting with that. I hope that other games decide to go after this level and try to do it a little bit differently. But a standout moment from that campaign, but we should probably cut it.
Yeah, I mean, the face shifting, it was a jaw-dropping moment. I had a grin pretty much the entire time playing through it. It was very neat, very cool, but you hit the nail on the head. I've played this game before. It's called Singularity, and that's kind of a bummer. It's a little bit derivative, but yeah, it's very, very neat, very unexpected. I don't think it's my favorite gameplay moment though. So let's cover what we have left. I'm going to go ahead and cut that one, the time travel level. So we have still Doom's opening, Battlefield 1's tutorial mission, Mafia 3's post-credits stinger, Hitman's Agent 47 plays drum solo disguise. We still have Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion. We also have Inside's ending, both of them. All right, so let's talk about that because that's the last one we haven't discussed yet.
Okay, so Inside is a follow-up, or if you ask the right people, it's a prequel to Limbo. And the reason that most people think it's a prequel to Limbo is the way that the ending plays out. So there are two endings to this game. The first time you play through it, you don't know that there's a secret ending. The first playthrough, you play as, first of all, you play as this boy. He's kind of escaping this, it's basically a concentration camp. There's no dialogue in the game. You're kind of just piecing together from what the set pieces are, and you're escaping this concentration camp, and you go through the game kind of escaping death. And there are many memorable and gruesome ways that character dies that you almost assuredly not solve the environmental puzzles the first time around. At the end of this, you come upon this like science experiment, and you've already been kind of experimented on. You actually die in the course of that game. That one of these like underwater creatures kills you, and then out of nowhere you like sink to the bottom of the ocean and you develop gills. So you're kind of at the end of the game, you're already a little bit more than human. You survive. You play as this boy. You can all of a sudden have the ability to breathe underwater. At the end, you reach this science experiment, and you decide to unplug the science experiment. What the science experiment is so this entire game you've been seeing these like humans walk zombie-like through like a factory, and you've been kind of controlling them. There's some mechanical puzzles with that. And at the end of all of this, the like end experiment is that these scientists are trying to create this human monster that basically this huge blob with a bunch of like arms and legs appendages. So you unplug him from the like water tank, and then the monster blob absorbs you. And then the last 20 minutes of that game is you as the blob running through, destroying everything in your path, kind of getting your revenge. And it kind of just ends, all this destruction ends with like the blob escaping, and you kind of just sit on this beach just to be like content to be a blob. Okay, so that's ending number 1. Ending number 2, if you happen to like find all the games like secret collectibles, they're like these little like light things. You have to kind of follow a series of steps. There's an environmental puzzle. You're going to need a walkthrough to basically figure this out. At the end of that series of events, you find out that basically you uncover this like secret cave where there's a person controlling a computer screen. It's kind of like a meta level joke that like the blob is trying to, or so the conspiracy says, that the blob has been trying to like control you to get him to free you this entire time. And what you uncover in the secret ending is the like player character, which is supposed to be you playing the game, but you're playing as this boy. And it's all this like meta level Inception, like insert the Inception noise here joke. And then you have the option in the secret ending to basically unplug the computer and basically stop the blob's plan, which leads to Limbo, which is why people think Inside is a prequel to Limbo. So you're basically the boy trying to break out of the simulation.
So meta.
This is basically the like Matrix trope of like Neo escaping the Matrix and bringing his powers into real life, right? I think those are both very interesting, but I don't think you're going to get to that moment if you don't play through all of Inside first. And the secret ending is something most people aren't going to see. It's very complicated to get to. And like the main ending, I don't think like gives us a lot of satisfaction if you just play the one where you become the blob and you destroy everything. Like that doesn't do it for me. It's not interesting enough. I think people will like that. I think it's very artistic, but it's not doing much for me when I compare it to some of these other gameplay moments or cutscenes. The Mafia 3 cutscene is way crazier than both of those things combined. And let's cut Inside's ending, both of them, because I think it's one of those things where you can probably watch it on YouTube.
You talked yourself out of it, mostly because I didn't play Inside either. That's one of the major games that I think I missed, and a ton of people recommended to me personally. So we need to wrap this up because we're running way too long in this list. We have still left Doom's opening, Battlefield 1's tutorial mission, Mafia 3's post-credit stinger, Hitman plays Drum Solo Disguise, and Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion. I want to call it. We have to say the Mafia 3 post-credit stinger. Maybe we need to rename that title to give it the spoiler, because that would really give it its due. I think that has to win this category, but then we would have to pick 2 runners-up among the other 4.
Okay, so the 2 on this list that I think are both like we're putting up there as like level design, Battlefield 1's tutorial mission and Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion. I think between those 2, I would pick Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion over the tutorial mission, only because the rest of the single player campaign in Battlefield 1 doesn't live up to that moment, that very first 10 minutes. And the first 10 minutes of Doom are a lot stronger than the first 10 minutes of Battlefield 1. And most people aren't even going to experience the Battlefield 1's tutorial mission. They're going to jump straight into the multiplayer. So I think for me, let's cut Battlefield 1's tutorial mission. Let's keep in Doom's opening and Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion. And I can't believe I convinced you that the post-credit stinger in Mafia 3 is worth sitting through that very, very average game for. It's totally crazy. It's really fun. And I recommend, if you're not going to be interested in playing through the about 20-25 hours of Mafia 3, I recommend looking up this ending on YouTube. It's jaw-droppingly awesome.
You don't want to fight for the Hitman drum solo part?
No. I think that's a cool. I think that's a cool kill, but there are also cooler kills in that game.
That's true. That is true. We probably should have nominated those 2. Okay, so congratulations, Mafia 3 again wins it with its post-credit stinger, with runners-up Doom's opening and Dishonored 2's Clockwork Mansion level. Moving right along, we have Guilty Pleasure of the Year is our next category.
All right, so the candidates for this list are Pokemon Go, Tom Clancy's The Division, Clash Royale, Pocket Card Jockey, Hitman, and Sid Meier's Civilization 6. All right, Taylor, I
want to make this easy for you. We need a brief for this category. Yeah, it's got to be Civ 6. Come on now. Come with me on that.
I absolutely agree. I think Civilization 6 is the guiltiest pleasure this year, despite the fact that it's a Civilization game, and you would expect it to be the guilty pleasure every year a Civ game comes out. But,
pretty much, yeah.
But I think Civ 6 does a really great job of getting you interested in its new mechanics, its new art style, and making the like just one more turn aspect of it that has you like playing way past your bedtime like really fun, really interesting. Everything about Civilization 6 is very, very appealing and gets you to keep playing it over and over and over again. And like you feel really guilty playing it into like the wee hours of the morning and losing like entire weekends to it. I totally agree with you. It should win this category. Let's talk about the other two candidates though. I don't think The Division is good enough. I think that game was very interesting when it first came out, but I think after the first few months of people experiencing it, basically the same thing happened with Destiny or any other MMO. I think a lot of people were very interested in the beginning and then kind of fell off of it. And then their like post-launch support wasn't good. The balance was off. The like DLC that first DLC that they did wasn't very well integrated. The like Dark Zone was the most interesting thing that was happening in that game, and it didn't keep people engrossed in the like loot Diablo style thing that they were going after. We have to cut The Division because I don't think it was interesting enough to like captivate us for the entire rest of the year that they were planning on keeping everybody's interest for.
The spirit of this category, because we didn't really explain it too well, I think it's a captivating game that may or may not be addicting, but it's maybe something that you might feel guilty about enjoying or playing way too much. That's, I think, the spirit of this category. It's the fact that you've played it too much to admit that you have a problem, that the game, you're dumping too many hours into it than it really, really deserves. You keep replaying the same things over and over again, I think is what we're getting at here. For that reason, I think we have to cut, I don't know, I want to say Hitman because I don't really feel guilty about playing Hitman. The guilty aspect for me was how long it took me to sort of plan and disguise myself and sit there and sort of plot my next actions. That's the part to me where it was so captivating. I think I spent way too much time on those missions to try to get better scores at the end. But I don't know. I don't feel ashamed. I don't feel guilty about it at all. And this was a game that I played through once. I didn't go back and replay the same missions. So perhaps it doesn't win as a runner-up in this category. Civ 6 for sure. I'll say my piece about that in a bit. But what do you think about Hitman?
I think Hitman actually surprised me about how much I enjoyed it. I am a little bit ashamed about how much I enjoy replaying the content in Hitman, and how much I really enjoyed playing out the different scenarios, the different costumes. And that game is so good at giving you kind of like a breadcrumb trail, but it doesn't like follow it all the way through. It doesn't like do the kill for you. You have to kind of like take it all the way to its natural conclusion. And I think for me, that's the part of it that was very pleasurable. So I think the two standout scenarios in that game are the Paris level, the first one, and Sapienza. But to me, the surprise of Hitman was how much I enjoyed the way that they've supported this game, the elusive targets, the structure of it is something I totally would have expected to hate. And in fact, I really, really enjoyed it. And like, I don't want to admit that because then they're going to make other games in this mold, and not every game can fill this mold. And I think it's a credit to IO and Square Enix to really get behind Hitman, a franchise that I've really enjoyed over the years, but hasn't really been this good since Blood Bunny. It's just been so open-ended and a lot of fun. I actually think it deserves to be one of the three. I wouldn't cut it quite yet. Let's have the conversation about Clash Royale versus Pocket Card Jockey. So Pocket Card Jockey, as I said on last week's episode, is basically a solitaire game made by the people behind Pokemon, and it's horse racing themed. I think it's a guilty pleasure for me because I really enjoyed a lot of it, but I'm not still playing it. I just admit that it was like a very nice surprise, and we already had that category. I think I'm safe to say that I'm as a big fan of Pocket Card Jockey, let's cut it from this list.
So we have left Pokemon Go, Clash Royale, Hitman, and Sid Meier's Civilization 6, which we already decided is going to win this category. I don't think we need to spend a huge amount of time picking runners up, right? But between Pokemon Go and Clash Royale, which one would you have to pick?
I'm still playing Pokemon Go every day. I am ashamed to admit that because
okay, there you go.
It's a bad game. It's not a very deep game. And in fact, the things that they're adding to it this week, we actually even got news that they're doing sponsorship deals with Sprint and Starbucks, which makes me not like that game. I don't like going to the Sprint store. I don't like going to Starbucks. but they're going to make Pokestops out of those places.
And yet you're still playing it. That's pretty much the definitive. I mean, that's like the definition of this award.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really speaks to how strong the nostalgia is for Pokemon. Pokemon Go definitely got me re-interested in Pokemon Sun and Moon. If Pokemon Go didn't come out, I probably wouldn't have picked up Pokemon Sun and Moon, to be honest with you. I think that game existed to bring people back into the Pokemon fold who haven't been there in quite some time. And I think it really did a good job, despite the fact that it was really shallow. It's definitely in the right direction. They need to do more with their franchises for sure, but definitely a standout guilty pleasure of the year. So we're going to award our guilty pleasure of 2016 to Sid Meier's Civilization 6 with runners-up Hitman and Pokemon Go. All right, Taylor, we're going really long here. Let's move on to our next category, biggest/most important news story. The story that we, despite our best efforts, tried to keep off of the podcast, yet couldn't stop thinking about.
Right, so these are incremental console upgrades. So we're talking about the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio that were both announced. The Pokemon Go pop culture phenomenon. Nintendo reveals the Switch after months of NX rumors. Counter-Strike Go skin gambling scandal. Disney Infinity dies as the Toys to Life sales overall dwindle. The VR headsets Oculus Rift and HTC Vive launch blunder. No Man's Sky becomes one of Steam's lowest rated games. Ubisoft staves off Vivendi's corporate takeover. Weak AAA launch sales potentially foreshadowing another game industry crash. And Nintendo's NES Classic Edition supply and demand problem.
All right, so the spirit of this category is both an acknowledgement of the stories that we couldn't stop thinking about this entire year, but also stories that potentially could impact the gaming industry in the future, whether it's the near future next year or the coming future later on. I think there are a few stories this year that definitely embody that, but let's talk about ones that we shouldn't put up there as the biggest, most important news story. I don't think that after this year, anybody is going to really think about Disney Infinity anymore.
Yep, I agree.
I think
totally.
that category died when Disney said, okay, we're done. Disney, obviously behind the Marvel franchise, put out its best effort, and like Disney Infinity didn't sell well, and they closed that studio, and it was devastating. However, that's a kids game, and there will be better kids. There already are better kids. The Lego games are better kids games.
Yeah, and Lego Dimensions still exists, and also Skylanders still exists, and they're still going strong, but their sales are dwindling too, and so you see a lot of sales, especially on Black Friday through Cyber Monday and Cyber Week. Stores are clearing out their shelves. They're trying to get rid of these things, and I don't think there's a future for that. I think that the same thing sort of happened with music and rhythm games. You don't see more Rock Bands, Guitar Heroes that are being developed, released because they take up too much shelf space. They're too expensive. People don't want all these plastic toys, instruments that are extremely expensive. They don't want them anymore. So I don't think it's the biggest, most important news story. There are more bigger, more important stories here left on this list.
Okay, for that same reason, let's also cut the CSGO skin gambling scandal. I think that was a scandal that happened over the summer, and it was certainly hot news when it happened. Potentially a lot of money happening, changing hands, potentially on the gray or black market. Ethically, the fact that streamers were willing to get involved with a very popular game's kind of shady underside is disgusting. Really says a lot about where the shady side of esports. But in terms of like where that could go, I don't think it's going to be a big story beyond this year. I think Valve really clamped down and did the right thing, but we'll see if it pops up its ugly head again with more litigation. There are bigger, more important stories on this list.
To explain what happened a little bit, so streamers were promoting CSGO skin gambling websites that they were getting kickbacks from. So what was happening is, you have all these esports athletes who were saying they would throw matches, or they would instruct whoever they were playing against to throw matches, conspiring to gamble. And what they were doing is they were getting kickbacks, and they were part owners of certain gambling sites. And it ballooned up to this huge problem that Valve had to step in and say, we have to cut this market. There was this huge market totally outside of the game, this black market where modders were creating skins for this game and then selling them for a huge amount of price. We're talking about like hundreds of dollars. These virtual items, these are not tangible goods. People were spending real life money on and then losing them to matches that were total bullshit. So they were fixed from the start, and it became this huge problem. The FTC was starting to investigate. But as far as this extending into next year, or this thing rearing its head again, I don't think it's going to happen again. So I think we can cut it. The Oculus Rift and HTC Vive launch blunders, I think for the most part has settled down. And I think this kind of thing happens with every new hardware launch. There's always some sort of issue where, they sell out too quickly. People are complaining about certain hardware issues, and then manufacturers have to step in and replace them. In this case, what was happening was certain people who were pre-ordering these headsets were getting their stuff shipped to them either damaged, or people who kickstarted initially were not receiving their headsets before those who were pre-ordering it through normal websites. And that was a huge bummer, and a lot of complaints about that. And I just think that sort of comes with the territory. So I think we can cut it. But beyond that, and we'll talk about this in the worst trend category, which is coming next. I think they both sort of failed to launch, but in a different way, in the sense that it hasn't reached a critical mass. Not enough people are buying these things, period. So we can talk about that for worst trend potential.
Right. And it's too expensive, and they didn't build a case for why people should get invested in VR. There isn't like a killer app. And I think that was a really big part of the story of why VR hasn't taken off quite to the extent that everybody thought it was going to be. Everybody said it was going to be like the second coming. It just hasn't happened yet. So for that reason, I don't think if it had been bigger, or if the launches had been bigger, if there was a killer app, I think there's an argument there to be made. But I agree. Let's cut it from this list. We have the Pokemon Go pop culture phenomenon, and the No Man's Sky becomes one of Steam's lowest rated games. The reason I want to put those two games side to side is because I think they absolutely dominated headlines this year.
Exactly.
Pokemon Go was a game that didn't come out of left field. We knew that they were developing it, but to everybody's surprise, like, it was really, really popular. I saw people of all stripes being on their phones. I live next to a big public park, parents with their kids, where the kid in the stroller is playing the game and also the parent is playing the game. It was crazy. It brought out people to this like phone app that, like, I haven't seen this much excitement around like a free to play thing basically since Farmville. It really says something that really dominated our gaming conversation for basically an entire season. I went to Japan, and right when that game launched in that territory and like dominated their conversation over there too, I saw people like running over each other, trampling each other just to catch like Dragonites. It was crazy, and it was something unlike anything I'd ever seen. I do agree with you that it was a fad that has kind of become passé. The game wasn't shallow enough it wasn't deep enough to continue following beyond its kind of initial gameplay, but I did think it was a really big story, particularly for Nintendo, and it definitely helped Pokemon Sun and Moon sell a lot more copies than it probably would have originally moved had they not driven everybody's interest back into Pokemon.
Completely agree. It was a huge story. People who don't normally play video games were hearing about this, wanting to play it. My boss started talking to me about it. I would see people on the street with their phones, and they're huddled together, and I'm like, well, there must be a Pokemon standing right there. And it was this augmented reality game that you don't see a lot of those. You don't see a lot of mobile games that use that technology. And with this kind of franchise, I think Nintendo did a huge job. We can't give all the credit to Nintendo. We have to say Niantic also. Niantic, the developer, along with the Pokemon Company, were the ones that put this game out. But yeah, it was huge news. You saw sort of these meta level weird stories happening where people were finding dead bodies, for example, in areas because there was a Pokemon Go player that stumbled across them. You had people cooperating. There was a whole side business of taxi drivers and Uber drivers that were saying, hey, hire me and I'll go take you on a Pokemon Go adventure. It entered pop culture in a way I've never seen before with video games. I think the closest thing I can compare it to was maybe the Nintendo Wii. You started to see outlets that don't talk about video games talking about this thing to a huge extent. Like, it was on the Today Show, it was on NBC Nightly News. These people don't talk about video games at all, and you saw these stories appear on these outlets. So I think it has to stay on this list.
I think it has to be one of the three candidates. I totally agree with you. There was that like crazy 60 Minutes piece where they drew the fake Pokemon. That was really, really funny.
Yep.
So I want to talk about, we've talked about enough about that. Let's talk about the flip side of that, which is utter disappointment with a gaming product, which is No Man's Sky, right? It didn't win our biggest disappointment, I think, because a lot of people actually enjoyed how serene No Man's Sky is. But when that game first came out, it was like a hot mess. It wasn't the thing that people really wanted it to be. One of the most hyped up marketing campaigns that I think I've ever seen. Dominated the conversation in the gaming world for about a month and a half or so, and then people kind of like, it's like, okay, that game sucks, let's move on, there are other games that are coming out. And then it came up in conversation only more recently when they said they were going to release a Foundation update, which was totally not enough to like go back on how disappointed everybody was with that game. I actually just started playing it recently. I think that game still sucks. I don't think there's any way to like get it out of the morass that Hello Games and Sean Murray really like. They oversold this game to like it's not the next coming. It's definitely not the next SimCity. It's not even the next like Spore. It doesn't deserve like the amount of time that we've given it. I think this is one of those stories that was hot at the time, but in terms of like its long lasting impact on the gaming industry, like I think people are just going to be wary about marketing and PR campaigns and pre-orders from this point forward. It's No Man's Sky was hyper disappointing, but one of the top 3 biggest stories this year, I'd put it maybe 4 or 5.
No, I completely disagree. I mean, you made the case right there, right at the end, which was that it has a far-reaching influence, like it's impacting companies, developers, publishers from marketing their game in a way, and it's changed policies. Like, for example, Steam, like Valve had to readdress their refund policy. For a while, people were in their Steam reviews encouraging everyone to get refunds for the games because they did. And then, Steam has this very lackadaisical policy about where, if you haven't played for a certain amount of hours, you could get your full refund, no questions asked. But in this case, because they were losing, I think, a lot of money on No Man's Sky in upfront sales, what was happening was Valve started to clamp down on those requests for refunds. And so it impacted Valve in that way. It also impacted Valve because overwhelmingly negative reviews started dominating. Like, I think it was, if not one of the lowest rated games of all time, it was the lowest rated game of all time. I'd have to fact check that. But that sort of just proves how incredible the amount of attention this game was paid to by everyone, the games industry. I mean, everyone was paying attention to this. Sony hyped it in a way, made false promises, supported Hello Games. Hello Games, same thing, overhyped this, made promises they didn't deliver on. It was just a hot mess. There was whole situations where Sean Murray went radio silent on social media. Same thing with Hello Games. Developers weren't responding to the feedback. There was a situation where their account got hacked, and I think it was the Hello Games official Twitter account that tweeted out No Man's Sky was a mistake, or whether it was him or Sean Murray's personal account, I can't quite remember. But regardless, it just drew all this massive internet drama. It dominated the conversation this summer.
Oh, okay.
It was one of the biggest, most anticipated games of all time, and for it to flop like this, critically, sales-wise, I think was a huge disaster. And it might not be one of the best news stories that we're going to remember, but it certainly was one of the biggest, most important ones.
Okay, I think you've made the case. Let's put it as one of our 3 candidates, and let's talk about whatever the third one is. So I'm going to cut Ubisoft staves off Vivendi's corporate takeover.
Right. It doesn't have much meaning.
Yeah, and I don't think average Joe Walmart cares about what happens to Ubisoft. Thankfully, they staved off of Vivendi so that they don't start shipping crap games. Ubisoft, depending on your point of view, they might already start doing that, but Ubisoft is here to stay. Thankfully, they do a lot of interesting games.
That was speculative, and the other thing that's speculative on this list is this weak AAA launch sales potentially foreshadowing another game industry crash. That may or may not happen, and I don't think that was a very huge story that anyone paid attention to this year.
Right. I think that was only a more recent story after like the sales numbers came out for Titanfall 2 and Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty. Call of Duty has been on a downward trend for a while now. Like, this Battlefield is like the first new Battlefield game that's like pretty good after the kind of disappointment that Battlefield Hardline was. And Titanfall 2 is a successful follow-up to a game that like the multiplayer's lifespan wasn't there. So I don't think that any of the poor sales of those games portend like gaming totally crashing. I don't think the game industry is headed for a crash. I think if we have another year where more of these AAA titles don't succeed on their own merits, then we can start to have this conversation about whether it has more of an impact on the industry overall. But I just don't see that story. I agree with you. So the NES Classic Edition, the supply and demand problem that they've been having with getting those things to stores. This is a repeat of the Wii, of every console that Nintendo has ever put out.
And Amiibos also, same thing.
Nintendo continues to have this problem and they never learn their lesson. This is going to happen again with the Switch. And then eventually Nintendo will solve the problem. The NES Classic Edition is an unfortunate situation, I think, for a lot of people who are interested in buying this product. But I'm not shocked to hear that Nintendo has totally bungled their demand for this thing that is way highly anticipated.
And the other thing about Nintendo, okay, we can cut that off the list. So this other story we still have left on this list, Nintendo reveals the Switch after months of NX rumors. Pretty much all those Nintendo NX rumors, that's what the prototype was codenamed, came true. We knew it was going to be a hybrid handheld home console, and turns out that's exactly what it was when they made their announcement. And why I don't think it's one of the biggest, most important news stories is that Nintendo has revealed very little details about it beyond the trailer that they put out. It was that, and then they said, okay, we'll see you next year when we're going to reveal Breath of the Wild stuff. And I just want to see more news about this before I consider it the biggest or most important news story.
The last thing that I think should be a candidate, well, by default it's the candidate because it's last around this list. The incremental console upgrades in the PS4 Pro and the upcoming Project Scorpio have something that have been highly anticipated. Consoles haven't really gone here before. We expect this kind of stuff more on the PC side where you have to upgrade video cards and GPU and there's all these different configurations. And the console market has basically existed on the fact that you have this one closed box that's going to exist for 5 to 10 years and it's going to play all the games for that generation and it's always going to be the same. And then Sony and Microsoft both like jump into the hole together to say like, we don't want that to be the case anymore. We need to sell more hardware. We're going to plan on putting on these consoles that are going to push forward 4K gaming, that are going to have graphics at a higher fidelity. And, if you're interested in upgrading to them, we're going to try to like make the case that some of these newer games are going to take advantage of these new feature sets. And it's going to be more expensive, but I'm sorry if you're an early adopter, but just trade in your new console and buy this new upgraded professional edition console. And then, at least in the case of the PS4 Pro, like that came out, and then it totally bungled some of the promises that it made. Like some of the games that were purported to have like pro patches to have better graphics actually had worse frame rates, and like it didn't make it feel like the PS4 Pro was an upgrade at all. It actually felt like it was a downgrade. And then the Project Scorpio is total black box, right? Like Xbox said that they were going to put out this Xbox One S, which is something you'd expect them to do, a slimmer console. And then they said, well, wait a minute, we're getting behind the VR headset space. We need to build a bigger, better box. We're going to have developers develop stuff for that console. And the default Xbox One or the Xbox One S isn't going to do it. We're going to get behind this professional level console upgrade. Yet we haven't seen like console manufacturers do this. And it's totally become, again, this like complete Wild West of like, well, okay, I'm trying to buy this game, but can I trust this reviewer? Like, what kind of hardware are they developing it on? Like, this is the same kind of problem that we have on the PC. You don't know typically what like the graphics card is. You don't you're going to have this like wild like support problem of like, okay, I'm playing the new Mass Effect on the original launch Xbox One, but it looks a lot better on the Project Scorpio version. Like, maybe shell out a little extra money for that. Who knows where all this is going to go? I think for that reason, I've actually just made the case why it's the story that has the longest tail and definitely is going to be with us for the next year and beyond, potentially on how the Project Scorpio stuff plays out. The PS4 Pro, we already know how that plays out. I have a Pro, and to be honest with you, it was for me, the upgrade made sense, but I don't think for a lot of people it did. And it's up to Sony to decide whether or not they're going to continue to support that, or they're going to continue to support the launch PS4, or they're just going to scrap everything altogether, all those plans, and just make a PS5.
And compared to PC, and you see the sort of universal platform being developed where the same games are playable on both the PC, even more and more games are getting ported on PC and console. So it really doesn't matter what you play it on. Microsoft gets behind their whole Xbox Play Anywhere program, where you buy one, you can play it on the other. You can buy it on the PC, on the Windows Store, the Windows 10 Store, and then also play it on your Xbox One. these sort of things are massive changes, especially with the advent of 4K gaming. Now you see more people buying 4K TVs. They're getting cheaper and cheaper. It's more affordable to get into that. People actually care about HDR support, better frame rates. They want their home consoles to match the PC experience, the high-end PC experience, and in a way that it hasn't done before at all. So it's this uncharted territory, and I think it really sets a precedent for this kind of thing to happen moving forward, where the next thing beyond the PS4 Pro or whatever the Project Scorpio is for the Xbox One family, it's going to last 10 years, and they're only going to iterate and improve upon their existing console. They're not going to rebrand it in a new way and say, this is a huge leap. We need to create a whole new generation. And so we're not going to go from the 360 to the Xbox One or from the PS3 to the PS4. Instead, we're going to go on PS4 Pro and PS4 Pro S and so on and so forth. And you saw a bit of a preview with that with the Xbox 360, but it wasn't a huge jump like it was in this way.
Increasingly, I'm finding more and more reason to play on the PC as opposed to the PS4 because they just haven't made a good case for these incremental upgrades that they originally thought they were going to be. So let's just crown this the winner and move on. I think this is the biggest story to come out of this year. We totally did not see this coming. It's something that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future, as long as home consoles continue to be a thing.
I don't know. I still feel like the Pokemon Go pop culture phenomenon hit the mainstream in a critical mass in a huge way. I think that's truly the biggest, most important news story.
I think when I think about it, the amount of talk that I heard from people who don't play video games, who talk about Pokemon Go, who still talk about Pokemon Go. I have coworkers who still play that game, and it totally captured the imagination of people outside of our industry, outside of our field of interest. When I think about its impact on the future of mobile games and the future of what potentially Nintendo could be doing down the road, when I think about it, I think you're right. I think the Pokemon Go pop culture phenomenon has to take it over, a slight edge over the incremental console upgrades, which I think is also a story that has a long tail, has a very big impact. But yeah, let's do it. This year's winner for biggest, most important news story is the Pokemon Go pop culture phenomenon. Tailing right behind it are runners-up, the incremental console upgrades of the PS4 Pro and the Project Scorpio, and No Man's Sky becoming one of Steam's lowest-rated games. All right, Taylor, let's move on to our final category of the night and of our honors, the worst trend that we saw this year in 2016. We have gaming's toxic anti-women attitude. These are the stories with Allison Rapp, Baldur's Gate transgender NPC, and the Smash Brothers sexual assault story. Konami milking the Metal Gear fan base post-Kojima. There was that pachinko machine, Metal Gear Survive, that's coming out. VR headsets not ready for prime time because they're cost prohibitive, the lack of great games, the tracking issues. Companies not releasing games to critics pre-release to inflate pre-orders. So this is Bethesda, other game developers are doing this. PS4 Pro making some upgraded games actually run worse. Those games namely being The Last of Us Remastered, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, the list goes on and on. Nintendo's DMCA-backed crusade against fan games, how they shut down AM2R and Pokemon Uranium. And finally, one of the worst trends, highly promoted and hyped games failing to deliver. This list includes No Man's Sky, Quantum Break, Mighty No. 9, Street Fighter V. What do you think is the worst trend of this year?
Some of these have been a trend for a while, like the Nintendo's DMCA-backed crusade against fan games. They're very protective about their IPs, and they constantly fight these fan games that use their assets or characters. So I don't think that needs to stay on this list. I'm going to go ahead and cut that. It's a bad trend. I don't know if it's the worst trend for this year because it constantly happens. For me, VR headsets not ready for prime time, only because me personally, I was super hopeful. I bought into the hype. I was so ready to read the reviews and be like, okay, now I'm just going to take my pick about which one I'm going to buy. And then ultimately I decided, wow, all of them have some sort of problem with them, whether it's they're extremely expensive, there's just this lack of amazing games. There might be, actually, I would say there are a handful that are extremely recommended, but just not enough to justify buying, a $800 plus headset. And even with something as cheap as a PSVR, which can be $500 or $600, it's still a huge, huge investment for technology that just doesn't work the way it should. The tracking with some of these headsets, like, for example, the Oculus Rift and the PSVR, suffer from stuttering issues, so it causes some nausea. And the HTC Vive even has its own problems with those lighthouses, and if your body is blocking those sensors as well, it's just not as precise as you'd want it to be, so it causes a lot of jitteriness, and you can clearly see this when they're demonstrating it on their live streams and their videos, and you see all these reviewers saying they should improve this. Like, we have to wait until they either update the firmware or come out with, some sort of incremental upgrade. They need to improve the hardware in some way to make it commercially viable, because it's just not there yet, despite the high requirements for the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive for the PC. I mean, you have to have a high-end machine that's going to cost you somewhere in the ballpark of $800 to $1,200 minimum. So that's just a huge bummer. And for those reasons, I think it's a really, really bad trend, because I wanted to see VR headsets succeed immediately. I was so excited for us to enter a new generation of gaming.
Okay, I think it deserves to be one of the three candidates for the worst trend. I actually think that the worst trend on this list is gaming's toxic anti-women attitude. And if I'm being very honest, unfortunately, this is not a new trend. This is something that actually blew up last year over the Gamergate movement. But this year, it really took out some very important people. I think it really harmed women. People like former Nintendo employees, Allison Rapp. She basically isn't in the game industry anymore because of this really crappy anti-women attitude. It's something that makes me frankly ashamed of continuing to have this as my hobby, that we continue, like, more women play video games than ever have before, and we continue to push them out more and more and more. There was a story that we didn't report on about a sexual assault case that happened with Smash Brothers Melee. Smash Brothers is a totally big part of the fighting game community, and that happened. There was a transgender NPC that stoked the internet flames in Baldur's Gate. It's one of those things that keeps happening. It makes me feel sick to my stomach, and it makes me so sick that I want to stop talking about it. And I don't think it deserves any more airtime than I've actually just given it now. So let's cut it. Compared to the rest of this list, it's not even the same league. And if it keeps happening, it's just one of those things that I think is going to push out more and more gamers.
Well, you started off that whole argument by saying it was one of the worst trends, but then backed off of it. I certainly think it could qualify, because it just happens over and over and over again. And I think it's going to reach a point where, I don't know, the whole Gamergate stuff is disgusting, and it's still going on. And it's still a trend. It's still affecting women in the games media. I mean, I don't think players are feeling safe in spaces where you're playing competitive fighting games like Super Smash Brothers, for example. You hear about sexual assaults at conventions. It always seems that women have some sort of story about feeling harassed, or they don't feel like they're being represented. And it just doesn't come down to women themselves. You could even extend this into the LGBT community as well. So this isn't something to be proud of, and we need to draw more attention to this issue, bring more light to it, to change the attitudes of our community. And I agree with you. Unfortunately, we get a lot of negative press, a lot of negative attention from the mainstream. And when you say that you're a gamer, that's a loaded term that comes with a lot of baggage in some cases. For people on the outside looking in, and they hear about swatting, for example, that's a terrible thing, that not related to this, obviously, but this absolute toxic anti-women attitude where we're just not inclusive of women, we're not respectful of our female players, for a community where more and more they're becoming the majority and males are becoming the minority. You see a lot more casual gamers, especially with the advent of smartphones and tablets. More and more women are getting into video games, and I just don't want to reverse that trend. So let's skip it for now. We need to cut a bunch, and let's wrap this show up. Konami milks Metal Gear post Kojima. I think we knew that was going to happen. Is it going to be a worse trend? Who knows? It still remains to be seen. But so far, what's that new Metal Gear game that they announced that's so bizarre?
Metal Gear Survive. Yeah,
that's it. Oh god.
So I like the gameplay of Metal Gear, the Phantom Pain 5, the last game that we actually awarded our Game of the Year last year. But it's not surprising that once Hideo Kojima left the building, that Konami was going to totally milk Solid Snake and that whole franchise for what it was worth, which is, to be fair, quite a lot. They held on to the IP, but yeah, they turned it immediately into a pachinko machine. They're immediately going to use the assets of the Fox engine to make another game, crap out another game. Whether it's good or not, we'll see. But very expected news, and it's not the worst trend because it's something we expected.
This one about Bethesda, companies not releasing games to critics pre-release to inflate pre-orders. I don't think it affects too many people, and not every single developer and publisher is jumping on this bandwagon. I don't think it has a huge impact. And to me, maybe this might be a good thing. It might force reviewers. There's always been this sort of weird thing where reviewers are receiving free copies of games, and whether or not that influences their sort of bias, right? That they feel compelled to give something a high score so they can continue to receive free copies, free review copies from developers and publishers. That's always been this sort of weird thing in this industry as part of the press. And I just don't think that same problem extends to people who are just casual gamers or hardcore gamers, whatever, who are buying these video games. It doesn't affect them in really any way beyond the fact that they're not going to see reviews drop day one. They're going to have to wait a little bit. I just don't think it's going to affect pre-order numbers in the way that we're expecting. So I just don't think it's a super, super bad trend. It's not the worst trend of this year.
I agree with you that the average gamer isn't paying attention to that. They're just seeing the flat, 5-star system, 10-point system, or is this game good or not? Yes, no. And then they move on. I think the story about the PS4 Pro making some upgraded games actually run worse would be a bigger deal if there were more games that actually supported the PS4 Pro. There right now, the best use case scenario for that console is Final Fantasy 15. That's okay. It looks great on the Pro. It also runs fine on typical PS4 hardware. And so far, the part of this story that's bad is that Sony has totally unjustified this console upgrade that they want to sell you on.
They're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, aren't they?
They are very much shooting themselves in the foot. But, if that happens, I don't think it's that bad, because then you're just stuck with the base PS4 or the Slim. Okay, great. There have been console revisions before, and they're going to continue to, RAM is going to get cheaper, GPUs are going to get cheaper, and potentially console revisions in the future will be more powerful and more efficient for an equivalent cost. And I think that's generally a positive thing, even if the Pro doesn't, or the forthcoming Project Scorpio doesn't turn out to be the thing that they tout it to. So let's cut it. Let's cut that from that list.
All right, with cutting that leaves gaming's toxic anti-women attitude, VR headsets not ready for prime time, and one we haven't discussed yet, which is highly promoted and hype games failed to deliver. So those include, as examples from this year, No Man's Sky, Quantum Break, Mighty No. 9, Street Fighter 5.
Yeah, and if you want to replay our whole biggest disappointment conversation from the last episode, that's basically this category wrapped up in a one news story. A lot for every good game this year. I felt like there were 2 or 3 that were really, really terrible, but were promoted as they're going to be the next thing in this franchise, right? Street Fighter 5 is going to be Capcom's entire fighting game platform for the next decade or so, and then it comes out, and then they don't support all the features that they said they would at launch. There's no single player campaign. There's no arcade mode. It's basically just a very stripped down version. The multiplayer doesn't work very well. Same thing with No Man's Sky, right? Not the thing it purported to be from the get-go. Disappointed a lot of people. Such a story that No Man's Sky, before that game came out, was already hyped up to be the game to end all games. And then it came out, and then all those same outlets were like, this game is the story about this game is the game to end all games of this type. It's not the chill space simulator that we all thought it was going to be. Quantum Break, same story, highly hyped up by Microsoft. It was going to be this cool, like, you're playing a TV show. It's going to be the next game from Max Payne, Alan Wake, games you really like, cult classics, really big fans of. And then it comes out and it's a very by the numbers shooter. And the TV parts of that are like 30-minute episodes. It's just like, why isn't this just a TV show? Why is this a video game? Mighty Number 9, like, what a crap show from start to finish. Like, a Kickstarter, like, huge success story. Over 70,000 people backed that game. And just,
we don't need to rehash this. We talked way too much about this during Biggest Disappointment last week.
I think those 4 games alone, we have so many games that are so hyped up, have huge marketing and PR campaigns that, like, are going in the future. Games that I like are going to be in our most anticipated games of next year. This could potentially happen too.
Agreed with all those points, and we're probably going to see this trend continue into next year. And again, it's trending downward. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of games just way under delivering, and unfortunately, it's happening to classic franchises. Street Fighter V is just, what a bummer. I mean, No Man's Sky, this is a new IP. Oh my goodness, that's going to go down as all time one of the hugest disappointments ever. So that is a super terrible trend. I don't think we've ever had a year where just there were so many massively supported games, whether it was fan supported or financially supported in the case like Mighty Number 9, one of the biggest Kickstarters of all time. Super unfortunate. I mean, that's a pretty strong contender for winning this category, but for me, it has to go up against the VR headsets not ready for prime time. That would be the other one. I would think the anti-woman attitude can be a runner-up, but for me, it's between those two. The VR headsets not ready for prime time, and highly promoted and hyped games failing to deliver. My vote would be the VR headset, because that was another situation where they were highly promoted, highly hyped. Then all of a sudden you see all these announcements about the price, and then people are now complaining where if you actually own something and you're playing a game that's multiplayer, you see 0 people playing online just because of the install base. There aren't enough people buying these things because of how cost prohibitive they are. The lack of a library there at launch. There's too many exclusives that are being released on one platform and not the other. We're noticing that it's really obnoxious to own one of these headsets because it just is. It's not worth it. They haven't done much to justify spending all this money up front, and then never mind all the tracking issues that come with the nausea. And it's kind of a bummer. It's really a bummer for something that's supposed to be this new emerging technology. We thought that they had been testing this, developing these things, and to launch them in a way where consumers aren't confident, aren't buying these things because of the limitations of the hardware itself, where the hand tracking, the head tracking, the eye tracking, all of that is not great. It's just, it's so obvious watching other people playing it without you ever having to putting on a headset yourself and experiencing it firsthand. So for me, it was just a failure to launch, a massive failure to launch. And unfortunately, I think this is going to extend for at least one more year. So it's definitely a bad trend, maybe our worst.
I think I agree with you. You've made the case for me that why this is the worst trend. And I think this is one of those trends where even if they do the fix, even if they do the revision to the headset that there's rumored that's going to be coming down the pipeline, I don't think that's the solution to the problem. I actually think that makes the problem a lot worse. On top of the fact that these are very expensive things, and this is supposed to be the future of gaming, and it turns out that it's mired in its past about making the titles way too expensive, and that there isn't a game that you can point to and say, okay, this is the killer VR thing that's going to really sell you on it. For the most part, what you're hoping with the VR headsets is that one of your friends made a really impulse decision, has one of these headsets, and you can play it at their house.
Yep.
And you don't have to ever buy it or experience it at your own place because you don't have you don't have the computing budget to support the kind of hardware that these headsets need, or you don't even have an apartment big enough for these headsets. Even with the PSVR, potentially the PS4 has a really wide install base, and there isn't a killer app for that thing, and it has a lot of stuttering issues. is terrible from start to finish. What a bummer that is, that VR just really failed to launch. It was one of those things that everybody was super excited for. It hasn't come to fruition. Definitely this year's worst trend. And unfortunately, I think one that, if I'm being honest, I think is going to continue in the future.
Yep, exactly. And you can't discount the fact that it was 3 different manufacturers. Actually, you could even extend this to like Samsung with their Gear VR and Google Cardboard, for example. If you want to include those, it's that all these companies missed their mark. All of them had some sort of problem with them, just from the fact of being either cost prohibitive, the lack of great games, or some sort of tracking issues with the hardware itself. So no congratulations here, but we think that VR headsets not ready for prime time is our worst trend for 2016, followed up with gaming's toxic anti-women attitude, and also highly promoted and hyped games failing to deliver. Well, if you've stuck with us for this long, we want to say thank you for listening to the super long breakdown of our 2016 Game of the Year deliberations in our Honors and Special Awards categories. We're going to wrap it up now. That's it. Remember to listen and subscribe to our show, the 1P versus 2P podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn, or Clamor, or just bookmark our website, 1pvs2p.com, where you can read our gaming blog there too.
A wrap-up of our awards thus far is available at the link in the show notes if you're interested in reading about some of these honors and the winners in their respective categories. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on Twitter. We're very active across all 3 mediums. On Twitter, you can follow us at 1pvs2p_podcast.
As always, thank you to Phonetic Hero for letting us play his music for our show, Coffee Stomp, and Super Manly Brothers X. Those songs are part of the compilation project Chip Tunes Equals Win. I'm Taylor Ray. That's my co-host Ryan Ray. Thanks again for listening. Finally, we're going to be back next week with our Editor's Choice Awards, our top 10 personal list. So stay tuned.
And like shoots the senator.
What?